Okay.
Let's go into chapter 5, dealing with civil rights. What kind of questions do y'all have from civil rights?
Jim Crow.
Don't worry about it. I don't see it as one of the terms, so don't worry about that. Dred Scott was basically the slavery case. And if you remember in the Dred Scott case, the Supreme Court said that Dred Scott was not a man, but rather that Dred Scott was property, and property cannot sue. And they basically threw the case out. And this was the case we were talking about where Dred Scott was suing for freedom. There was an agreement that Dred Scott would be free. This was kind of an organized case because they wanted Dred Scott to have the power of the Supreme Court behind him, but then the Supreme Court ruled against Dred Scott. But the most important thing is this is the worst case in American history, a lot of experts say, because they said he wasn't a man, they said he was property, and property, whether it's a cactus, whether it's a horse, whether it's a car, and I use some of these examples in both of the classes, you can't sue, property can't. Go ahead.
Brown versus Board of Education.
What was there were two cases. There's Plessy versus Ferguson and Brown versus Board. There's two statements. There's one statement from each case. What are the statements?
Brown versus Board of Education. That's the one where they used the doll to prove that separate but equal wasn't real.
What was the doll test actually?
They would get kids separately and have both a black and a white doll.
Yeah.
And they would ask which doll is better, which doll you are.
Which doll are you and which doll do you want to be?
Yeah, there we go. Which doll do you want to be? And most of the kids would choose they would say that the black kids would say they were the black doll, but they would want to be more like the white doll.
The doll test was significant in Brown versus Board of Education because for the first time, or one of the first times, the court was using sociological evidence. They were using sociological evidence, and basically what they were saying is these kids were branded with like a badge of inferiority at such a young age. They knew what they were, but they also knew that they wanted to be something else. They said that separate but equal is basically poisoning them. It's got to go away. So they used sociological evidence to strike down separate but equal, and the case that established the principle of separate but equal was Plessy versus Ferguson. So keep that in mind.
You said, say that the last part again?
The case that established separate but equal was Plessy versus Ferguson. And if you remember in that case, who was Homer Plessy?
Wasn't he like a man, like a light-skinned man?
He was a very light-skinned...
With the train. Black man.
He was a light-skinned black man with the train. He was considered 1/8 black, but that was enough to basically be considered black by the law. But he was a very light-skinned black man. If you look at him, you wouldn't have necessarily thought he was black. You probably would have thought he was white. He was with the trains, Jeep. Anybody, help me out with this. What was he doing? What was he suing about?
He wanted to buy a ticket at a segregated ticket. He bought a ticket in the white section, and they sold it to him. He then went to the authorities and said that he was black, and he got arrested. But then the courts came up with separate but equal.
Okay, let me pull you back on this, and everything that you said is basically spot on. Plessy he was a very light-skinned black man, and train cars in Louisiana were segregated. So he bought a ticket on a train in the whites-only section. He actually specifically told the authorities that he was black and he bought this ticket. And then, in fact, when he attempted to board the train car, they arrested him for violating separate but equal. If there was somebody that you would think would be able to strike this down, it would be a light-skinned black man. I mean, this would be the least controversial case that maybe they could bring. And in fact, the court did not strike down segregated cars, but they said separate but equal. They said in this instance, the cars themselves were equal. Yeah, they're separate, but same number of seats, same number of windows, same basic facilities. These cars, anything in public facilities, as long as they were equal, they could remain separate. When you get to Brown versus Board of Education, and I'm sorry to kind of go back to it a little bit, but effectively what they began to realize, and Plessy was 1896, Brown is in the 1950s. Over the course of time, separate but equal turned into, in a lot of places, separate and unequal, which meant that the facilities were nowhere close. And if you remember, we talked about the water fountains, we talked about the bathrooms, we talked about some of these other things. Go ahead, G. You started?
You said Brown versus Board of Education was when? 19 what?
It's in the 1950s. I think it was 54. Other questions from civil rights?
Which, chapter 5?
Yes.
That would be the quote on page 95 that you want us to know?
Don't worry about it.
Don't worry about it.
Yeah, don't worry about it. Go ahead, Julia.
Sexual harassment.
Sexual harassment. I don't know that we talked about this a whole lot, but in the context of political correctness, it's kind of the same thing. And if you remember with the political correctness articles, I had told you that it doesn't matter if you say something that you think is okay. It doesn't matter if you say or do something that the majority of the group thinks it's okay. But whether it's political correctness or sexual harassment, if one person complains, that's where the problems can come from. So you've got to be thinking about how other people are going to react to your comments or react to your actions. And if you remember, when we were talking about political correctness, what did we talk about? We talked about Iowa and the DOA. We talked about the Delaware Department of Transportation. We talked about fried chicken and collard greens with Tiger Woods. We talked about articulant. You remember articulant with Joe Biden? I mean, take a good look at some of these things. Because, and even the Seinfeld thing. Things like reservation and scalp and Indian giver and things like this. Again, it's not what we think is okay, but it's the group. We also had talked about how if you're taller, you get paid more. We talked about Little People of America being upset. We talked about some of the words that they banned in New York on those end-of-year achievement tests. I believe we had also even talked with New York, golly, well there was another one, about the Mr. and Mrs. being banned. Make sure that you're comfortable with what some of these things were, where they were from, this kind of a thing, because I mean, I can't lie to you. I mean, it lines up as a perfect essay question in the big scheme of things. So make sure that you're comfortable with those. Go ahead.
Logos?
Don't worry about logos. Yeah, we never really did anything with logos at all.
And other groups. That's what other groups.
Yeah, the only thing that we had talked about with other groups that's actually a term, well, there were two. One was the Americans with Disabilities Act, and I had read you the quote that dealt with ADA and how much change has occurred in the last 20 or so years. The other thing that we had talked about with other groups was knowing. And the idea behind knowing, and this was talking about orientation, people that knew somebody that was gay would be more likely to accept that lifestyle, that choice, that whatever, however you want to deem it. But if somebody did not, then in fact they would be less inclined to be accepting of that. So kind of keep that in mind. Do y'all remember invidious discrimination?
No.
Discrimination is not prohibited. Discrimination is not prohibited. So it is legal to discriminate, but you've got to have a rational, you've got to have a justifiable reason to do so. And the idea behind invidious discrimination is you cannot ride this ride unless you are this tall. That's a safety issue. So technically you're discriminating against short people, but it's for their safety. 16-year-olds being able to drive, 18-year-olds being able to vote, 21-year-olds being able to legally drink. All of those are forms of discrimination, but they're invidious discrimination. If I said blonde females could not do something, well, that's going to be harder. That's going to look just like discrimination against blonde-haired people. However, with that being said, if it's 16, 18, 21, these have been established as safety issues, or you can't ride this ride if you're not above a certain height. So discrimination is legal as long as you have a real reason for it, and not something that's kind of hateful or stereotypical. Go ahead.
The Missouri Compromise.
Don't worry about the Missouri Compromise on this one. Don't worry about the Missouri Compromise on this one. Go ahead.
Number 7 in the chapter question.
Yes.
I was kind of like confused to find an answer.
I think I'm going to take number 7 off.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I'm going to take number 7 off.
Are you sure?
Yeah, I'm going to take number 7
And
off.
how were the Japanese Americans treated during the World War II?
That was dealing with the American internment camps. And if you saw it in the chapter, the Japanese Americans were actually kind of rounded up into internment camps, or they were called, some people referred to them as American concentration camps. So after Pearl Harbor was attacked, if you looked Japanese, you basically could take what you could carry, you got on a train, and they sent you out to an internment camp that was out in the middle of nowhere. Wyoming had some of these. And the idea is that they were thinking that maybe some Japanese Americans had helped the attack on Pearl Harbor. They removed them from California and the West Coast, with the thought being that they might help a Japanese invasion of the United States. And then, they weren't killed or anything like this. They weren't necessarily given the best accommodations, but they basically had to give up their life, with the exception of what they could carry in two hands.
So they removed them to where?
They removed them to isolated places. So like if they were in an internment camp, if they escaped, it wasn't like they'd be able to go and cause trouble. If they escaped, they might not even be able to live. That's how isolated they were. And for example, Heart Mountain in Wyoming was a place that had these types of camps.
Was it more so because the U.S. felt more intimidated for spying?
Well, I think what it really was Japan attacked and Germany and Italy didn't. I also think that it's because the Japanese were more easily identifiable because of their physical characteristics. So if Germany would have attacked, they probably wouldn't have rounded up the Germans. It's because the Japanese look different. And that's why this is within the context of civil rights. Make sure that you're good with those two amendments. The 13th Amendment, of course, ended slavery or involuntary servitude. We talked about that. That's kind of a quickie. The 15th Amendment, though, has actually got a video up there, and we talked about the voting rights test. Just really, really quick to kind of lay this out, what was the problem with the 15th Amendment? Go ahead, G.
I think it was like, they said they didn't state why they did. People didn't have to allow black people to vote. For example, like there'd be the jar test.
Okay.
You would go to vote, and there'd be I think it'd be like jelly beans or something like that.
There's the
inside
jelly
of a
bean
jar.
test.
Yeah, inside of a jar, and you would have to state how many. You would have to tell them how many jelly beans were inside the jar.
How could they have written the 15th Amendment so that that wouldn't have mattered? Anybody?
They gave like, oh, hold on. Like the way.
How could you have written the 15th Amendment? Because both of your classes did it. How could you write the 15th Amendment so that, in fact, it gave, it wouldn't have mattered about the jelly bean test?
You can discriminate on accounts of race and gender, so they used another thing.
You're talking to me about how it was written, kind of.
Yeah.
They basically wrote in the 15th Amendment that you could not deny somebody the right to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Race, color, or previous condition of servitude.
Oh, not gender.
No, not gender. So, yeah, they were still not letting women vote then. That didn't come about for another 50 years. But race, color, or previous condition of servitude. But what they did is that meant that you could discriminate somebody from voting for other reasons. And that's where the jelly bean test comes in. That's where the literacy test comes in. That's where the poll tax comes in. The soap bubble test comes in. You get the idea. And there's a video, like I said, that's posted in there. Pay good attention to those voting rights tests because we spent a decent amount of time on it, but also be able to explain the 15th. And to kind of go back to that, Juliana, you said they wrote the 15th. You cannot deny somebody the right to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. If they would have just said the newly freedmen have the right to vote, it wouldn't have mattered what the tests were because it specifically gave them the right to vote. But the way that they wrote the 15th Amendment was, you can't deny somebody the right to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, but that means that you can deny them for other reasons, like not knowing the number of jelly beans in a jar, not knowing the number of bubbles in a bar of soap, not being able to read something on a literacy test, and so on and so forth. Go ahead, I saw your hand.
So when number 5 said briefly explain the significance of Rosa Parks.
Yes.
So should we know like what her action did, or should we know what?
Well, what she did and then what it led to. Because, when she got arrested for sitting in the wrong place on that bus, it started a bigger movement, obviously, than Rosa Parks. So, yeah, kind of tell me the story. And with her, that would probably be more of a short answer.
Okay.
That would probably be more of a short answer on that one.
What is the racial integrity act?
which one?
The
Rosa
Racial
Parks.
Integrity
Rosa
Act.
Parks.
Parks? Okay.
Number 1.
Number one.
I wouldn't worry about that. But I'll tell you the ones not to worry about. I promise. That'll
Go
be
ahead,
today.
go ahead.
Okay, because I know we're running out of minutes on this. We haven't really talked about articles. So let's jump in here because I did tell you that Chapter 5, articles and the links were going to be kind of a big deal. Looking at the articles, we did talk about political correctness. We have not talked about the NBA dress code. Make sure that you're comfortable mentioning several of the players because it mentions Paul Pierce and it mentions Marcus Camby among some others. Make sure that you mention specifically what the dress code said. What kinds of things did it ban? Do-rags, headphones indoors, hats cocked to the side, sunglasses like Shore's wearing, chains, the approximate with pendants, the approximate size and weight of a small child. Now that's not exactly what it said, but the article says this. And what was the argument of the players? Why did they feel like that this was discriminatory? What's that?
It was discriminatory to all black players.
The argument is that this was targeting urban or maybe black attire, black youth, this kind of a thing. The NBA is like 80% black at that time, and the argument was if you put together a dress code like this that deals with, things that a particular group wears, then you're discriminating against that particular group. What could they have done that would have basically not been a discriminatory dress code? Because they listed all these things you couldn't wear. What could they have done?
You could just say wear professional
Just
attire.
listed the things that you could wear. Business casual, suit jackets, maybe coat and tie, whatever the case is, but list the things that you could wear, and that's where the NBA got into a little bit of trouble. Of course, I showed you Allen Iverson, if you want to talk about how Allen Iverson presented himself. I also showed you Chris Paul. These were two of the links in there, so maybe take a look at both of them, because Iverson was before the dress code, Chris Paul was obviously after the dress code came about, and things changed around. Surgeon General. What do y'all remember about the Surgeon General? Yes, she was literally obese. Surgeon General is the person who, in fact, if you'll recall, Surgeon General was in fact the person that's the mouthpiece of the government on health issues. And what's the number one health issue in the United States? Obesity. There were people that got really angry because even though Regina Benjamin was eminently qualified, made house calls, didn't charge people in rural southern communities when they couldn't pay, even when she did house calls sometimes, the idea, and her resume is sparkling, she represented the biggest health issue in the United States. And there were people that said that she should not have that job. On that page, you'll also see a Chris Christie thing in there, and we talked about this not just being about size, but it also being about gender, because women are judged very differently with their clothes, with their hair, with their appearance than men are. We also talked about a Solicitor General being, not a Solicitor General, a Surgeon General being somebody that maybe if she lost weight while she was in office, then in fact she would be, modeling the behavior that she wanted. Her not appearing to be healthy might undermine her ability to communicate her message. So there were a number of ways that you could go with this. Juliana, if you'll stop it again, how far is it?
17 minutes.
Yeah.